Hello, everybody. Thank you for your patience with the signing process as we kind of figure out our space again with the new fuse shelves. And thanks for coming to your local independent bookstore. We love having you here. I'm Alex, and your attendance and book purchases let us have these events, so we're really grateful for you. Tonight we have the honor of hearing from Jason Zengerle about his new book, Hated by All the Right People, Tucker Carlson and the Unraveling of the Conservative Mind, with David A. Graham. Jason Zengerle is a contributing writer for The New Yorker. He is a winner of the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting and the recipient of a New America Fellowship. He lives with his family in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. David A. Graham is the author of The Project, How Project 2025 is Reshaping America, and a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics and national affairs. Hope you all enjoy the event. Thank you again, and remember you can get a copy of Hated by All the Right People up front after the reading if you haven't already gotten one. We'll also probably be able to do a little bit of signing after if anyone didn't get their book signed. All right, thank you.
Thank you all for being here. It's a great honor for me. Jason Zengerle has been one of my favorite writers since I discovered magazine journalism, and an inspiration to so many of us, and also a source of frequent jealousy for his stories. This book it's a wonderful book. If you have not read it yet, it is a story not just about Tucker Carlson, but about media and the American right and the culture overall. And we're here in this kind of fraught week in media too, as we watch events at the Washington Post. So I think there's much to talk about. Jason, I was hoping you could start us off by reading just a short passage from the book that I think frames a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about.
Okay. This is the passage that David wanted me to read. First of all, David, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. The mutual admiration. Whether Carlson really believes the awful things that he says these days matters less than that he says them at all, and that millions of people, members of Congress, titans of industry, the president, and just everyday Americans listen to and take their cues from him. What matters is that by saying these things, Carlson has finally achieved the fame, power, and influence that for so long eluded him. The story of what happened to Tucker Carlson between the gifted young writer I encountered as a New Republic intern in the late 1990s and the noxious talking head we all see today is the larger story of conservative politics and conservative media over the last 30 years. It is also the story of the United States during that period. In telling the story of Tucker Carlson, I hope to answer the question of what the hell happened to us.
I think you do that so well. One of the motifs here is this idea that comes through in the title. Can you explain where the title comes from and what you mean by it?
So I have to credit Tucker Carlson for the title. It's his words. He was in Budapest, Hungary in 2021. He was sort of one of the way Hungary is now like the center of American conservatism. I think Tucker is somewhat responsible for that. He did his Fox show from there for a week, basically doing an infomercial for Viktor Orban. And while he was there, he had dinner at Orban's residence, and he gave a lengthy toast to Orban for all the wonderful things he'd been doing, and he summed it up by saying, "You are truly hated by all the right people." And I thought, it was a good title, I thought, and I do think it sort of captures a pretty important element of our politics these days, which is that you're known by your enemies, and you can gain support among people by gaining the opposition of the people that they dislike. And it's it's something obviously that Donald Trump uses to great effect. I think people on the left use it to great effect as well, but Tucker certainly uses it in his media career, and also kind of his aspirations to be a political or a movement leader. He goes out of his way to antagonize liberals because he knows that when liberals criticize him, that makes him even more attractive to people on the right.
You alluded in that passage to your first encounters with him. Tell us how you first met him and what you made of him at the time.
Yeah, so I was just an intern at the New Republic, which is a liberal political magazine in Washington, D.C., and Tucker worked for the conservative analog to the New Republic, which is called the Weekly Standard, which was it was like the preeminent magazine of American conservatism. It was only started in 1995 as kind of a rival to the National Review, but it quickly sort of surpassed it. It was bankrolled by Rupert Murdoch, who had not yet launched Fox. it was founded by Bill Kristol and Fred Barnes and John Podhoretz, and Tucker was on the original staff, along with people like David Brooks and Charles Krauthammer and David Frum, like pretty impressive conservative writers. Tucker was, the sort of the junior writer on the staff, but he was probably the best writer on the staff, and he was only, a few.
I'm telling David Frum and David Brooks you said that.
Is the camera still on? I'll double down on that. Tucker was the best writer on the staff, and he was only, he's like 3 or 4 years older than me, but he was like way ahead of me career-wise when I was just an intern, and he was already a star. And he had a standing lunch date with another writer who worked at the New Republic, whose name was Steve Glass. I don't know if people have ever seen the movie Shattered Glass. Anyway, they used to go to lunch once a week, and he would come by the office sometimes to meet up with Steve, and sometimes Steve would keep him waiting, I guess ostensibly talking on the phone to someone he was interviewing, but probably not, since those people didn't exist. But Steve would keep him waiting, and Tucker would hang out by the where the interns worked in what was called the pit, and he would hang out by the pit, and he was actually like a super nice guy, and he was someone we all read and kind of looked up to, and he was very recognizable. He wasn't even on TV really at that point, I don't think, but he had a bow tie and the prep school haircut and a blazer and all that, and he would kind of toss us like little morsels of gossip or whatever, which we would hungrily scoop up, and then he would go off to lunch with Steve, and I'm sure they'd talk about much more exciting things than what he was telling us. But he was he was nice, and he was also just like a really good writer and someone whose writing I admired. He was not only like a good sort of stylist and a good reporter, but he was like actually fairly courageous. He took on subjects and took on targets that I think a lot of conservative journalists would typically shied away from. Like he wrote very critical pieces about prominent figures in conservatism. I mean, he wrote plenty of critical pieces about Al Gore and stuff like that, but he took on Grover Norquist, who at the time was probably the most sort of prominent and powerful conservative movement leader. And even more memorably than that, he eventually got hired by Tina Brown to write for a magazine called Talk. She left the New Yorker to found this magazine, Talk, with Harvey Weinstein. It was probably like one of the worst career moves in all journalism history. But it had a little bit of a run, and Tucker was one of her hires, and she had him write a profile of George W. Bush when Bush was still governor of Texas, but was obviously going to be running for president and was a Republican frontrunner. And it's a fantastic piece. Like, I remember at the time being really impressive, but going back and rereading it for this book, it's just, it's subtle, but it's really like devastating, and it sort of captures all the things about Bush, like his callowness, his stubbornness, his ignorance, all the things that made him such a bad president are like front and center in this piece. And and he wrote that, and that's not an easy thing to write, I think, if you're a conservative writer. So that was Tucker as a young print magazine writer.
You said he was very nice. You write in the book that he, over the years, could be a useful source in things where you would call him, he would crystallize stories. Well, what does he like to deal with? And what does he remain like to deal with over the years?
I have not dealt with him in a few years now. Since I started writing the book, we stopped talking. But he was always someone I really enjoyed talking to, just because he was quite accessible. Like, you would text him, and he would, before text, you would call him and he would pick up and you talk to him, and then after text, you would text and he would call you right back. 5 minutes. He liked to talk. He's a talker. And he, in addition to just sort of being someone who you would, get information from the way you would with the normal source, like, even though he had long since left his magazine writing days behind, he still had the muscle memory of a really good magazine writer. And he would help you kind of conceive of your piece. Like, he knew what you were doing. Like, he understood what you were trying to do. And so he would provide you with information and insight that, helped you along those lines. And then even beyond that, sometimes he would just like talk, and he'd be like, well, you can think of it this way, you can think of it that way. It was almost like talking to an editor sometimes. Like, and I don't want to overstate it. Like, we were not friends by any stretch of the imagination, but like, he talked to a ton of reporters. I was not the only one, but he was definitely someone that, I enjoyed talking to. Like, there are interviews you do that are kind of dutiful and some that are even painful. But like Tucker was always like a very like, kind of interesting and pleasant conversation.
And what made you want to write a book about him?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the genesis of the book, and I write about this in the book, is I was talking to my agent not long after January 6th, and he was trying to convince me to write a book about the coming Republican Civil War, because Donald Trump had shot himself in the foot, was never going to be a political factor again, and obviously you're really right on that. And there was going to be a fight within the Republican Party about who could take over the party, who would gain his supporters. And I was telling Chris that, Chris was my agent. Went to UNC actually. I was saying like the people who want to take Trump's place and are going to try to inherit his voters, they're going to stake out positions on immigration and on trade and on manufacturing, all these things that they think will appeal to MAGA voters. But so it's like Josh Hawley and Ron DeSantis and Ted Cruz, but none of those guys have Trump's charisma or his entertainment sort of talents, and it's not going to work. They're not going to get the MAGA voters. And just as like an aside, I said, like the only person who could actually pull that off is Tucker Carlson. And we both sort of paused and we're like, oh, maybe that's the book. And, the more I thought about it, the more I thought that Tucker would be he'd be a really good vehicle to tell this larger story of conservative media and conservative politics over the last 30 years, because the place that he started in is so different than the place he's wound up in. And I think his ideological and professional journey, I think, tells a much larger story. And I thought, and he's been he's either created or been a part of all of these institutions that I find really interesting, whether it's like the Weekly Standard or Fox News or the Daily Caller. And he gave me an opportunity to write about those institutions as well, and the people that he was part of a cohort that came to Washington in the mid-90s as sort of these young conservatives, and they've all wound up in such different places, and their trajectories have been so varied. And I mean, if you think about it almost in cinematic terms, Tucker is obviously the star of the book, but the supporting actors, I think, whether it's Bill Kristol or David Brooks or Laura Ingraham, all these people are kind of woven throughout his career, and it was a chance to write about them as well. So that was why.
When you started writing this book, Tucker Carlson was the premier Fox News host. In the process, he gets fired by Fox. And I believe at the time you wrote a piece saying that he would become even more powerful. How did you know?
Yeah, there was a little bit of motivated self. That was actually also that was sort of a memo to my publisher at the time, which was actually not well received, and they canceled my contract after Tucker was fired.
But you were right.
But I was right. Yes. I did. I mean, I don't want to say I wanted to be right, because I do think it's probably bad for our country that he's done this. But Tucker. I mean, the thing about Tucker and the thing that made him different than other Fox stars. I mean, the way it normally works at Fox is Roger Ailes used to say that he could have put a dead raccoon on the air and it would get better ratings than the person the year before, because Fox is the star, and it's just anyone will do well there, and that is true. Jesse Waters, who took Tucker's time slot, gets great ratings still. But in the past, when people have left Fox, whether it's Bill O'Reilly or Megyn Kelly or Glenn Beck, they tend to sort of disappear and they fade into irrelevance. I mean, Tucker did not, and I think there are a couple reasons. One, I think Tucker is smarter than them and more talented than them. But I also think that his firing actually kind of occurred at a fortuitous time for him. I mean, I'm sure he didn't want to be fired, but it was probably a blessing in disguise, because at the same time he was fired, cable news was already kind of in decline, and its decline has hastened since then. And this new world of streaming and podcasts has become so much more prominent and so much more important, especially on the right. And Tucker, he got a head start in figuring out that world. And, at Fox, he had this built-in audience. He didn't have to do that much to draw an audience. I mean, he did. He was the top-rated show on Fox, and I think at one point he was the most watched show in cable news history. But Now that he has to create his own audience, he's figured out ways to do it. I mean, he says and does things now that he didn't say and do at Fox. He's gotten more outrageous, more incendiary. I think he believes this stuff, but I also think that's a way to attract attention. He's attached himself to Donald Trump in a way that he didn't do when he was at Fox and during Trump's first presidency. He's just figured out the mechanics of how to stay in the picture, and he's done it in a way that like he's been able to kind of fold Fox and his firing from there into this larger narrative he spins about, elites and the puppet masters, and they want to control you and they want to keep things from you, and he's been able to kind of just weave that into this story, and it makes him in some ways even more credible, I think, in the eyes of his audience.
One interesting thing about his career is that, you write how he was really dismissive of television early on in his career. And he would eagerly accept invitations, but he thought it was dumb. He told his colleagues it was dumb. I'm curious what changed.
I don't know if I think he said it was dumb, but I don't think he really believed that. I mean, there was like a real sense among print journalists in the 90s that television was stupid, and it was like, I don't want to say people didn't think it was a passing fad, but they thought that power would remain with print, which was a terrible calculation on all of our parts, basically. Tucker had the foresight to recognize that print was in decline, and I like to say that if Tucker had been born like 30 years earlier, he would still be a print journalist today, because his heroes were like George Plimpton and Tom Wolfe and Hunter Thompson. Like, that's who he wanted to be. But I think he recognized by the late 90s that sort of career wasn't going to be possible anymore, and he wasn't going to have the fame and the stature and the money that those guys had. And the only way to achieve that was to go into television. But he and this caused like a great amount of sort of disappointment and consternation among his colleagues at the Standard and his friends in Washington, or writers like Christopher Hitchens, who were like, why are you wasting your talents on television? And Tucker used to always say, yeah, television's stupid, but he married very young. He had 2 kids already, I think, and was on his way to 4. And of course they were going to go to private schools, so like he had to worry about their tuitions. And that's what he would say. He'd say, I need the money. But and in doing this book, I sort of learned these things, like even while he was bad mouthing TV to all of his print colleagues, like he was studying it like really intently. And according to people at CNN, like he was like, he's like, the way he used to like read Joan Didion, he was like now watching Larry King to like get sort of interview techniques and skills. So I think he was a little bit like sort of two-faced there.
He really had to change his style on television too, right? I mean, he starts out, he's very sort of egg-headed. His producer at CNN has to like remind him to keep it stupid, basically.
Yeah.
And even his PBS show, you point out, was really, the level of discourse was way above almost anything else you would find on television.
Yeah, I mean, he said at the time, like, television is the enemy of nuance. And Tucker, I mean, there's several through lines in his career, but one of them is his contrarianism. But the job that he had at CNN, the sort of his best position there was he was one of the hosts of Crossfire, and Crossfire was CNN's kind of venerable debate show, and there were hosts on the left and there were hosts on the right, and he was one of the hosts on the right. And Crossfire was it was a debate show, so the host on the right had to take kind of the party line position of the GOP at the time. And Tucker, I think, was like a more sort of interesting thinker than that, more nuanced, and he sort of found himself sort of shoehorned into this role where he kind of always had to say Republicans are right, Democrats are wrong. And a lot of the times that wasn't a problem for him, but it became one, I think, especially in the run-up to the war in Iraq. He, I think, had some serious like private doubts about the wisdom of going into war in Iraq, and he swallowed those. And publicly, he was a cheerleader for the war. And and I think one of the reasons he was a cheerleader for the war was because his best friend from college worked for Dick Cheney and worked for Scooter Libby, and was sort of privately assuring him that there were WMDs in Iraq. But I think even more than that, his job would not allow him to be a critic of the Iraq War. Like, James Carville's on the left on this show talking about what an idiot Bush is, and this is going to be a disaster. Like, the conservative host has to say, no, you're a liberal surrender monkey, and we need to fight this war. to Tucker's...
Does anyone on television believe what they're saying?
that's sort of, that was the problem with Crossfire, and we can get to that in a second. But the one thing I will say for Tucker, though, I'll say several things for him, but after the war started, he very quickly came to the conclusion that it was a disaster. He went to Baghdad 9 months after the war started. He did a story for Esquire that's pretty good. And he came back and he said, I was wrong. This is a disaster. I'm embarrassed that I ever supported this. This is a terrible mistake. And he was really one of the first conservative pundits who had supported the war to acknowledge the mistake. And even beyond that, I think he was actually one of the few pundits who supported the war who really kind of grappled with that, personally. I think he actually did reevaluate other things that he believed, because the people that he looked up to, the people that he admired, whether it's Bill Kristol or John McCain, they were the ones who were supporting this war. And I think he started to wonder, okay, what else have they been wrong about? And at the same time, the people he had been told were, bad and shouldn't even be part of the conservative movement. I'm thinking here of Pat Buchanan in particular, who was a real target for the Weekly Standard. They wanted to read him out of the conservative movement. Buchanan, of course, had opposed the war. I think Tucker started to sort of wonder, okay, what else have these guys been right about? And it led him to start to reevaluate a number of things. He was, when he was at the Weekly Standard, he adopted the pretty conventional mainstream conservative positions of being, pro-immigration and pro-free trade. And I think he started to sort of think about Buchanan and paleo-conservatives. He started to, adopt some of their positions.
He also, in the process of doing this, becomes much more of an opinion journalist than it sounds like he ever was in his early writing career.
Yeah, he was not known as an ideologue at the Standard. He was a good team player, and he went along with stuff. He would write a nasty thing about Pat Buchanan, but it wasn't, I don't know if he believed it in his heart of hearts. He was really interested in good stories. He kept that anthology of new journalism on his office shelf and would pull it down. And he was known on staff as, the guy who was into a good story more than wanting to, advance the cause of national greatness conservatism or whatever David Brooks and Bill Kristol were onto that week.
So there's an important part of how the right shapes Tucker. There's also a theme throughout the book about how the left kind of helps create or helps foster Carlson. So he's an early MSNBC host. He has a PBS show. You talk about his friendship with Paul Begala, one of his co-hosts on Crossfire. What was his relationship with the left like in those days?
Tucker was a member of the club. Everybody in Washington knows each other. Especially in the world of political journalism, and a lot of the debates on TV and even the debates in the pages of these magazines were. I don't want to say TV was play acting. I think the debates in the pages of the magazine, they were sincere, but everybody was still friends afterwards. They would go to each other's dinner parties, they would go out for drinks together, they played softball with each other. In one time, the New Republic and the Weekly Standard had a paintball competition. Imagine who won that one. But Buckley Carlson, Tucker's little brother, turns out to be a really good shot. They were all friends. And Tucker was very much a member of this club. He actually, most conservatives in Washington live in McLean, Virginia. That's kind of their little enclave. Tucker actually lived in D.C., and he liked being a part of that world. He was, I think I call him in the book, he was, his social role in Washington is he was the invited skunk to the garden party. He was the guy you would have at your dinner party, who, with all your liberal friends. He was sort of the one conservative who would say something outrageous and everybody would laugh. He and Paul Begala would, go out, and Carville would go out after Crossfire was over and have dinner, and he would go on the road with those guys to do these dog and pony speaking gigs. He was just a member in good standing of elite Washington. When he was on Crossfire, he made a bet with Begala about Hillary Clinton's memoir that was coming out. I think it was her first. I don't know how she's written 4 or 5 now, but it was the first one. And he was predicting it was going to be a dud. It wasn't going to sell because she wasn't going to say anything. And he made a bet that if it sold over X number of copies, he would eat his shoe. And sure enough, it sold over X number of copies, and he was going to have to eat his shoe. And on the day he was going to eat his shoe, like Hillary comes to the Crossfire studio with a cake that's in the form of a shoe and surprises him and brings it out. She's like, it's a right wingtip, It's like, oh, that's so funny. I mean, like that was who he was. And Hillary like loved it. And they were pals. And when he went to MSNBC wasn't yet what we know of MSNBC today. Keith Olbermann hadn't gotten there yet. It was just like a network that no one really knew what they were doing. And after CNN, he kind of made a pledge to himself that he was never going to allow himself to be in that position again, where he had to, be a hack basically and toe the party line. And he wanted to have a more intelligent debate show, and he needed like a really smart liberal debate partner. And he was going through all the audition tapes, and he found one from a talk radio host, a liberal talk radio host at the time, who didn't really have any TV experience. And he brought her to the executives, and he said, "This is who I want." And they're like, "Absolutely not. Like, she is not cut out for television. She doesn't look like she belongs on TV. She's too smart, basically." And he fought for her, and it was like a knockdown, drag out fight. And he won over their objections, and that was Rachel Maddow. Like he brought Rachel Maddow to MSNBC. Maybe the TV executives would have discovered her eventually, but like that was her start there. So he has all these connections to the sort of the world now that he denounces.
So much seems to change in Carlson's life. The sort of what he's pronouncing. He's constantly getting in feuds with friends. He has this tumultuous relationship now with Bill Kristol. He has these two really durable ties you talk about in the book. One is to Neil Patel, and I guess they have a falling out and get back together, but he's a presence in his life since college. And also Susie Carlson, who he started dating in high school. I'm curious what you can tell us about her and the role that she plays in his career and in the path he's taken.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I didn't write this as a conventional biography, and I don't think Tucker warrants a conventional biography yet. So I don't have a ton of insight into his personal life. I mean, I gather from people. I mean, he's been with Susie since he was in high school. She was the headmaster's daughter at his prep school. And a headmaster, it was St. George's. So the headmaster was actually an Episcopal priest at the school. So they've been together since then. They got married right after college. I think it's a really genuine, serious relationship and a serious marriage. That's not common in television sometimes. But she is, as I understand it, she's just avoids all this stuff. She likes to read books, and she doesn't watch TV, and she's just kind of separate from him. And I think he had a tumultuous childhood. His parents got divorced when he was 6, and ultimately, when he was 8, his father was awarded custody of him and his little brother, and his mother disappeared, and he never saw her again from the age of 8 on. So I think he had a pretty tumultuous childhood. I think Susie has been kind of a stable presence since high school. She's very Episcopalian, and that kind of centered his life on the Episcopal Church for a while, although I think they both became really disenchanted with the American Episcopal Church, and that there's his religiosity today, I think, has something to do with that, and I'm sure Susie is somehow influential in that way, but I kind of don't know enough to say more than that.
Okay, let's talk about somebody who is neither stable nor Episcopalian. We have put this off, but we should talk about the guy who you write Carlson calls the Big Orange. What was Carlson's initial impression of Trump, and how did he become Fox's kind of go-to Trump figure in the 2016 campaign?
So after washing out of cable news, Tucker started a website called the Daily Caller, and his original idea for the Daily Caller was it was going to be kind of a conservative version of the New York Times or Huffington Post, devoted to facts, devoted to accuracy. The problem with conservative journalism was people didn't report, they just opined. After 2 weeks seeing the web traffic for it, he realized there was no audience for that, so he pivoted quickly, and the website became...
It's really inspiring reading what he said about the Daily Caller.
Yeah, he gave a great speech. Yeah, he went to CPAC, which is the big conservative conference, and he gave this speech positively name-checking the New York Times, and he's getting booed and heckled, and it was like a Sister Soldier moment. He went there to get booed and heckled because he knew that if you get booed in that room, people outside the room, the people he wanted to impress, like the sort of, mainstream journalists would like it. I mean, like, it's so funny, like, you go back and you look at the clips, and like, Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing this thing in the Atlantic, like, talking about what a great speech Tucker Carlson made. Anyway, there's a lot of goodwill for the Daily Caller when it starts. People like Ta-Nehisi and others are supporting it. Tucker realizes very quickly that they might be supporting it, but like the conservative readers are not interested in that. So he changes course, and eventually he winds up in this kind of rivalry with Breitbart News, which Steve Bannon is running at that time. And Breitbart is having great success, basically, being like a quasi-white nationalist website, with these really harsh articles about immigration, the black crime vertical. That's the one that everyone remembers, deservedly. And Tucker takes the Daily Caller in that direction, and by doing that, and has success, they get a readership, and so Tucker, I think more so, Tucker and Bannon both. I mean, more so than like other conservative pundits. Like after Mitt Romney lost to Obama in 2012, like, the Republican Party, like the diagnosis was, we have to moderate. Like, we have to moderate on immigration, we have to moderate on social issues. We cannot be as conservative as we once were. Tucker's running the Daily Caller and seeing like the audience for these really right-wing kind of views and articles, and he's like, well, actually, I don't think that's what voters want. And so when Trump announces his candidacy in 2015, conservative pundits just like dismiss it. And it's kind of funny to think about now, like, people don't remember this, but Fox was not a fan of Donald Trump. I mean, they wanted, if they weren't dismissing his candidacy, they were outright trying to like destroy it. And the problem was Fox, Roger Ailes recognized that Trump was good for ratings and they needed to talk about him, but they were having like a basic like television problem of producing a debate segment because every pundit on Fox was against Trump. And Tucker, who at that moment was like a third-tier pundit on Fox. He was the host of Fox and Friends Weekends, which is like dumber than Fox and Friends Weekdays. He's literally like driving go-karts on the set, and like doing cooking demonstrations with Billy Ray Cyrus. He wasn't getting airtime on the good Fox shows, but he recognized that Trump like had potential. He did not like Trump himself. Like, he was not like a Trump fan, but he recognized that like a nativist candidate running on white grievance could actually do well in a Republican primary. And he would say that on air. And these producers who were struggling to like do these debate segments on Fox were like, okay, we can get Tucker. Like, he's a camera. I remember like some producer said like it was a heavy lift to find a camera ready, articulate human being who could make a case for Trump, because like most of them were just like absolute freaks. So Tucker started getting a lot of airtime, and he was able to kind of ride Trump's rise to a more prominent role at Fox. And by the time Trump won, I mean, after Trump won the nomination, like everybody came along, they all fell in line. But Tucker was sort of one of the first to recognize Trump's, appeal. And when the election was over, Roger Ailes at that point had been fired because of the sexual harassment scandal. Rupert Murdoch has now stepped in and running the network, and his first move was to promote Tucker to an evening show. He gave him his own show, kind of rewarding his foresight.
And you write about how Tucker, during Trump's first term, was articulating Trumpism with much more clarity than Trump ever does, and becomes this sort of important formulator. But by 2020, he's become a little disaffected with Trump, right? Who did he vote for in 2020?
Kanye West. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Tucker was very wary of getting too personally close to Trump. Like, all the other Fox hosts loved the fact that they could go to the Oval Office and that Trump would call them after their shows and, kibitz, and they could sort of call Trump whenever they wanted to. Like, Tucker didn't want to do that stuff. I think he was a little personally weirded out by Trump, and I think he thought that if you got too close to him, you would be destroyed. It wouldn't end well for you. But he talked to Trump through the television show, so he didn't really need to. He was very influential just by talking to him through TV. But by 2020, he was really getting frustrated with Trump. He was angry at Trump for not taking COVID seriously enough. Then he was angry at Trump for taking it too seriously. He was really angry at Trump for not cracking down on the Black Lives Matter protest. And then by the time Trump lost, and he said all these things on the air. I mean, the thing that made Tucker's show like kind of interesting during the first Trump administration was like he was he was really articulating like a very coherent ideology, far more coherent than anything that Trump himself was doing. And he would kind of hold Trump to that standard. Like if Trump, deviated on, immigration, if he sort of like waffled a little bit on the border wall, like Tucker would hit him in a way that like Hannity never did. Hannity would just cheer whatever Trump was doing. Like Tucker actually, really sort of had a line and he wanted Trump to follow it. And by 2020, he felt like Trump wasn't following it. He was really angry at Trump for losing the election. He thought Trump blew it, and was even angrier when Trump, pretended he didn't lose the election because it ended up costing Republicans a Senate seat in Georgia. And by the time January 6th happened, like Tucker is just like fed up with Trump. These text messages that later came out in the Dominion lawsuit. He's calling Trump a demonic force and saying like, I can't wait till we don't have to talk about this guy anymore. And he was, he was really ready to move on.
So these texts come out, was it 22 or 23 when those emerged?
23.
23. And Carlson gets fired by Fox in what he believes and many people believe is a part of a settlement.
Do many people believe that? I know he does.
Oh, I don't know.
Do you? I don't know.
I don't know.
There's no evidence for it. He thinks that he thinks part of the Dominion settlement was his being fired, that Dominion wanted $1 billion. Rupert Murdoch wouldn't go to $1 billion, so he did $787 million, and Tucker Carlson scalped. But there's like no evidence for it.
Whatever the circumstances, he gets offed. He's off Fox and has to kind of rebuild. And part of that is he and Trump seem to mend fences. I mean, you write that by 2024 he's FaceTiming with Trump for 2 hours.
That was 2022. That was even
before. 22 about vice presidential.
Oh, yeah.
How do they come together? What brings them back together?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I do think like he's much closer to Trump today than he was in the first iteration. I think in part because he recognized he needs to be close to Trump in order to stay in the public eye. Like he wants people to know that he's influential because that way they'll pay attention to him. But like even before he got fired from Fox, he was sort of tiptoeing towards Trump. And I mean, I think that with Tucker, like he does have like an ideological project that he wants to sort of execute. And I think after Trump went away, he was looking around, okay, well, who's going to be the next Republican presidential nominee? And he wasn't impressed by the people he saw. I mean, I think there was a time where like Fox was really trying to build up Ron DeSantis, and like Tucker did his part with that. He had DeSantis on his show a lot. But I think he really did. I think in the end, he really wasn't impressed by DeSantis. And I think the more he looked at all these, people who were going to try to take over, Trump's sort of base and his movement, like he didn't think they were up to it. And I think he started to like say, okay, well, maybe Trump isn't that bad after all, because he did started making these sort of approaches to Trump. And at one point, I think Trump had been calling him and he wouldn't call him back. And like Don Jr. like went up to Tucker's cabin in Maine to go hunting with him. And I think, convinced him to go see his dad in New Jersey. And then he went down to Bedminster. And I think that was sort of the first kind of, sort of rapprochement. And it grew from there. But it definitely intensified after he got fired from Fox. And at that point, he really attached himself to Trump in a way that he never did during the first term. And Trump, I mean, the thing about Trump is like, no matter what you say about him, like you can always get back in. Like you're never fully dead to him. And look at J.D. Vance. And Tucker and he and Tucker made amends, and Trump. I mean, Trump recognized the utility of Tucker. They both had like sort of mutual interests. Like the first mutual interest was like screwing Fox, because Trump was really angry at Fox after January 6th because they disappeared him basically, and then they started to try to build up DeSantis, and he was angry about that. So the first thing that they kind of cooperated on was the first presidential debate of the 2024 campaign. The first Republican presidential debate was going to be on Fox. And of course, Fox really wanted Trump to participate in it because that would boost ratings. And Trump kind of strung Fox along, about whether he was going to do it or whether he wasn't going to do it. And the whole time he was like talking to Tucker about doing something with him. And then eventually, like right before the debate, Trump told Fox he wasn't going to do it. And then the night the debate aired, he released like a one-on-one interview he did with Tucker that they put up on Twitter, now X, that Elon Musk was controlling and boosting. I mean, that was, in terms of like the fortuitous timing of Tucker getting fired from Fox, I mean, right around when he's getting fired, Elon Musk buys Twitter, and Tucker's able to take his show to Twitter, and Musk boosts it. But this was like a serious blow to the ratings of this debate. And so that cooperation worked out well. And then, like in the 2024 campaign, like Tucker was like a member of the Trump campaign. I mean, he would speak for Trump at rallies. He talked to the Republican convention, off air, behind the scenes. He was advising Trump. I mean, he was the, he and Don Jr. were like the two most probably important advocates that J.D. Vance had in the vice presidential selection process. So he aligned himself with Trump in a way that, I think he never would have done the first term.
There are two big threads of Carlson that come out of this, and one is a guy who's basically willing to follow whatever talking points he's given. You talk about him being a team player at the Weekly Standard. He supports the Iraq War gamely. On Special Report, he sort of says what he needs to do, and to get back into Trump's graces, he's doing some of this. And on the other hand, he's a relentless contrarian. He's picking feuds with people. He likes to be against that. How do you see him reconciling those things in his current guise?
I mean, I think he would argue he's still speaking truth to power, and he's still holding powerful people accountable, and but it's how he defines who's powerful, and in his mind, or I don't know if it's in his mind, but he would argue that the powers that he's holding to account are the elites, and it's just always a they, and it's he doesn't acknowledge that Donald Trump controls the White House and Congress and the courts. But Tucker would argue that in spite of that, the deep state is out there, and it is trying to stifle Trump, and it's trying to, persecute conservatives and, accuse them of thought crimes. And he, I think he sort of tells himself that he's a truth teller and a freedom fighter, because this is the enemy that he's fighting against.
We'd like to open it up to audience questions, and while you think on your questions, I'm going to ask one last unfair question. Is Tucker Carlson going to run for president?
So I don't think Tucker Carlson wants to be president per se. I don't, he's not like Bill Clinton. This is not something he's been dreaming about his whole life. I do think that he wants to be more than a podcaster, and I think he does have a vision for the country that he would like to see it realized. I think right now, J.D. Vance and him are in perfect ideological lockstep, and J.D. Vance is a fantastic vehicle for Tucker's agenda. I mean, the only way I could see him running for office himself would be one, if he and Vance had some sort of disagreement, if Vance sort of started to toe an ideological line that was different than Tucker's. I don't think that's likely, definitely not before 2028. I think the second possibility, I think this one is more plausible, is that he would come to the conclusion that J.D. Vance just doesn't have the political talent to be elected president, and therefore, his entire project would be at risk. And I think he would then look for someone else. I don't think it would be his first choice to run, but I think if he couldn't find someone, I think he would do it. And honestly, given the direction politics is headed in and the way campaigns are being run now, it wouldn't be that onerous, I don't think. I mean, you just look at, you can do it from a studio. I mean, you have to do events, which he did in the 2024 campaign. He did this 16 city speaking tour. He's kind of done some of that stuff, and I think as fantastical as that scenario seems, it becomes less and less crazy every day, which is kind of scary.
On that note,
I'm having trouble reconciling the person you described with the person who went to Russia and described the grocery stores as the best thing he's ever seen. The person who has Fuentes as chummy. Is he leading or is he following?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think he has a really finely tuned political and professional radar, and it's been especially finely tuned over the last 10 years or so. And I think I think most conservative media figures like live in mortal terror of being out of step with their audience, and like you really see that in the text, the Fox text in the Dominion suit. I mean, and I think Tucker is going places where he thinks the audience is or will be. I mean, you know, he's like skating to where the puck is or where he thinks it's going to be, and I think that he thinks that's where the energy is. I mean, and you know, and I think he can tell himself that he believes this, and I think he eventually does. But I also think that there is a degree of audience capture there. You know, he doesn't want to be out of step with his audience, and you know, and I think, I mean, the other thing I think that is important to say about Tucker is, you know, when you say audience, like, I don't think he's just like a media figure anymore. Like, I think he's a very sophisticated political operator, and he is like a movement leader. And I think he wants to be a couple steps ahead of where he thinks the movement's going so he can then lead it. But he's anticipating where it wants to go, if that makes sense.
Jason.
Hey.
Could you talk a little bit about the role that Jon Stewart played in Tucker's origin story?
Yeah,
Because
sure,
I've always,
yeah.
you know, I remember that Crossfire appearance very, very well, but I always want to hear the inside.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, we didn't. Donald Trump and Jon Stewart are like the two most important people in this story. When Tucker was on Crossfire, you know, Crossfire became kind of the symbol for a lot of people of everything that was wrong with the American media, and especially after the Iraq War. And Jon Stewart, you know, would launch these nightly like fusillades against Crossfire and cable news on The Daily Show. And Crossfire really wanted to have Jon Stewart on. They thought he would be a fantastic guest, and Jon Stewart always said no. And finally, Jon Stewart agreed to be on the show. And Tucker actually like knew Jon Stewart. Like, they were actually friendly because like Jon Stewart used to always go on Larry King. And Tucker's original show on CNN called The Spin Room used to air at midnight. So he was always in the CNN offices late while Larry King was on. And Stewart and Tucker were both smokers. So they would hang out outside on the street, like for smoke breaks, and they became friendly. And so when Crossfire had Jon Stewart on, I think the Crossfire producers and Tucker like thought it was going to be, you know, they knew that Stewart said Crossfire was horrible, but I think they thought that he was in on the joke. Like, they all, you know, it was going to be like a professional wrestling, like play acting. Stewart was like not in on the joke, and he came in like just, you know, like loaded for bear and wanted to, you know, humiliate these guys. And he just started in on him right away in a way that it became very clear that he wasn't joking. It wasn't, he was taking the debate in a direction like you don't take it in very personal terms. And, you know, Paul Begala was the host on the left that night. And like, you just sort of see like Begala just kind of like sit back in his chair, like, I'm not going to say a word. And Tucker like takes the bait and starts to debate Stewart. And Stewart just, you know, he just eviscerates Tucker. And, you know, he says, you know, how old are you? You know, Tucker's like 35. He's like, aren't you a little, you know, you wear a bow tie? You know, just like really personal stuff. And, you know, at one point he calls Tucker a dick. And Crossfire then
on CNN.
Yeah, on CNN, yeah. And Crossfire had a studio audience it was at George Washington University, and like the whole crowd like erupts, and like they're taking Stewart's side, like they're cheering him on as he's insulting Tucker. And it was just like it was a public humiliation for Tucker. And it was humiliating in the moment. It was humiliating afterwards. Like, it was actually like the first viral video. Like the guy who created YouTube, I think, saw it, and like that was part of the impetus for him like creating YouTube. And a couple months later, the CNN has a new president, and he announces that they're canceling Crossfire. I agree with Jon Stewart. Stewart said, "You're hurting America." That was like his critique. And like the new CNN president comes in and says, "I'm canceling it. Jon Stewart's right. We're hurting America." And Tucker like he wasn't like technically fired, but he was, they let his contract expire. And it was, you know, I mean, people talk about like that moment at the White House Correspondents' Dinner when Obama ridiculed Trump. And, you know, if that hadn't happened, maybe Donald Trump never would have run for president. I do think there's like an alternative history where Jon Stewart doesn't do that to Tucker Carlson, and like Tucker Carlson isn't where he is today, because that really created sort of a seed of resentment. I think Tucker felt that, you know, the people in the club of which he was a member of like didn't support him and didn't defend him the way he wanted to, and he began to resent them. And then as his career troubles increased, I think that resentment grew. And then by the time he's talking about they and the elites, and I mean, we can talk about anti-Semitism later, but like certain prominent Jewish figures, I think like that that makes it easier for him, I think, probably psychologically, to attack those people, because he remembers that they didn't support him the way he wanted to when that happened.
Actually, could we talk about anti-Semitism?
Please.
So in last week's New Yorker, you have some great reporting on Carlson and anti-Semitism. And he goes from being this guy who has, his most important mentor is Bill Kristol. He's involved with a lot of Jewish figures at the Weekly Standard, for example. He rails against Pat Buchanan, as you noted.
He calls himself an Episcopalian neocon.
Yeah.
He loves Israel. Yeah.
And now he's a prominent defender of the neo-Nazi wing of the MAGA movement. How does that happen, and what does he really believe?
Yeah, I don't know. Good question on number two. I mean, it happens. I mean, the Fuentes thing was really interesting because he was in a feud with Fuentes. He was fighting with Fuentes, and he called Fuentes on his own show. He called Fuentes. Said Fuentes was a Fed. He was being controlled by the government to discredit right wing voices, and then he also said Fuentes was like a weird gay kid living in his parents' basement. And Fuentes, returned fire on his show, and they were having this fight, and Tucker was losing. Like, if you sort of looked at social media, like Fuentes' fans, they're called the Groypers. They were taking Fuentes' side and attacking Tucker. And I think Tucker has made the calculation that you can't be successful in conservative media or conservative politics these days unless you have the support of neo-Nazis. And he had Fuentes on his show as a peace offering, as an olive branch to this group, sort of saying yeah, actually, I'm with you. And and then he proceeded to conduct this softball interview with Fuentes. But I mean, it's funny because people are mad at him for platforming Fuentes. I don't think that's an issue. I mean, I think that Nick Fuentes' message is getting out there. He has his fans. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to have him on your show. I think you could do a critical interview with him and you can subject him to some scrutiny. And Tucker is more than capable of doing that. If in the run up to the attack on Iran last summer, I mean, he had Ted Cruz on his show, who was a big supporter of regime change in Iran. Tucker was very opposed to any kind of American military intervention there. And he humiliated Cruz. And he humiliated Cruz to such a degree I have liberal friends texting me, I will vote for Tucker. I will forgive the racism and sexism, and I will vote for President for Tucker if he stops the attack on Iran. It was this great horseshoe. But but the Fuentes thing, I think, there's a real, I think there's a legitimate concern about Israel especially among young people in the United States in the wake of October 7th, in the wake of Gaza. Real questions about what it's doing there. And I think, and these are people who I think probably have not paid much attention to Israel in the past, maybe not even paid that much attention to politics. But what Tucker and what Fuentes are doing is they're taking that, I think, sincere and legitimate concern, and they're leading these kids oftentimes in a really destructive and dangerous direction. I mean, I don't know if anybody saw that J.D. Vance talk at the University of Mississippi. After Charlie Kirk was killed, Kirk used to do these Ask Me Anything events on campuses, and so prominent conservatives went and started doing them in his place, and J.D. Vance went to Ole Miss and took questions from the audience, and this one young man stood up, and he just looked like your everyday SEC frat bro, basically. And he launches into this question about Israel being a persecutor of Christians and controlling American foreign policy and controlling our presidents, and why are we letting our presidents be controlled by this country that persecutes Christians, which is the line that Tucker and Fuentes say. And this kid does not look political at all. And for me, it was a light bulb moment, because it just really suggested that this stuff is penetrated, that it's gotten to that level. And I think what Tucker is doing on the question of Israel and sort of using that as a cudgel to hammer Jews in general in the entire country of Israel is I think it's really dangerous.
You mentioned that Tucker used to be somebody you talked to pretty frequently as a source, and then that stopped when you started writing the book. And I'm curious if you could share kind of how that went down, and if you have a sense of his reaction or response to the fact that you're writing the book or the book itself.
So when I started to write the book, I texted him. I was like, "Hey, can you give me a call?" And 5 minutes later, he called, like he always does. And I said, "I'm writing a book about you," and he was like, "Oh, well, you wrote a book about me. I'm not that interesting." And I made my pitch, and he's like, and he said, like, "Look, I really want to talk to you for it, but I'm not sure if Fox will let me." And it's really funny because Fox PR is they're total pain, but and if you were to text Sean Hannity, he'd probably say call Fox PR, he wouldn't even call you back. Tucker never worried about Fox PR before, but he said that he would try to get Fox to let him cooperate. And when we went back and forth for a bunch of months basically, and he said, "I'm meeting with them next week and we're gonna," and eventually it just kind of petered out, and I figured he was not going to cooperate. Then when he was fired from Fox, I was like, "Hey, you can cooperate." I sent him a text. He did not respond, and he didn't respond to any of my fact checking queries or anything at all. I have not heard anything from him in terms of his response to the book. He was quoted in an article last week. Someone asked him about it, and he said, "I didn't realize he was done with it. I don't know why anyone would want to read it. I'm not that interesting." So that's been his response so far.
So as members of the press, and in such an important role, journalism has such an important role, and you talked about the Washington Post and what's happening with that newspaper. What are your thoughts, or what is your hope for the salvation of journalism and free press?
Go for it.
You can take this one.
Find the right billionaire to own you, I guess. The kind of billionaire that owns the Atlantic versus the kind of billionaire that owns the Post. I don't know. The Post. I grew up in Washington. I learned how to reading the Washington Post sports page. It's personally, it's really depressing. I think one of the big problems we have in the country is the death of local news. I think it's great to have national publications, and it's great that there's the New York Times, and it's great that there's the Atlantic and the New Yorker, but I think in some ways it's more important that the Raleigh News and Observer be strong, because I think that it's really easy for people to question and maybe even demonize journalists if they never know any of them, if they don't sort of interact with them just on a daily basis, if these journalists aren't covering things that are immediately important in their lives. And I think we're in a situation now where the distance between sort of a New York Times reporter who parachutes into Nashville versus someone who works at the Tennessean who's there every day and covering school board meetings. I think it's really important just for democracy that you have that kind of scrutiny on these institutions, but I think it's also really important for news consumers to have a familiarity with those people and kind of a direct connection to them. It makes it a lot harder for them to distrust them and write them off. So I don't know. I'm not sure how you solve the finances of it. No one's figured that out yet.
Yeah, I feel very lucky about the ownership of the Atlantic, but I don't think that's a model that works everywhere. I'm excited to see new models and people trying new things. I see people here from the Assembly, which I think is a great example of a place that's doing local and state level reporting. We need more places like that, whether for-profit or not-for-profit. I think the big thing I'd say is there is a huge audience in this country for scrupulous, accurate watchdog reporting. And I don't know, if I knew what the model was, I would be doing that and not writing. But I do think there's an audience for that, and it will find a way. I just don't know when or how. Other questions?
I think the story is so sad. You described Hillary Clinton bringing a shoe cake. It's funny. It's lovely. Mm-hmm. And these people who got along behind the scenes. And what's your sense of the current loss of culture? And I know the word is probably elitist. But when we lose that, what have we lost? And I'm thinking of Tucker Carlson, can he go to the same places he used to go?
No. He had to leave DC. I mean, yeah, and I think like when people ask about, does he really believe this stuff? I mean, he lives in like a bubble now. I mean, when I said he was a member of, the DC club, that changed. And when Trump became president, it became harder and harder for him to sort of be a member of that club. And then it just became kind of impossible for him to live in Washington. Like, he couldn't go to the dog park without getting yelled at. Eventually, like, protesters showed up at his house, and he wasn't home, but his wife was home, and she had to call 911, and that was sort of the final straw for him. And he moved. He now lives. His family has long had a vacation home in rural Maine on an island on a pond. He lives there for 6 months. Then he spends 6 months on another island in Florida, and like he lives in this little like bubble basically. And he sort of traded like David Brooks and Bill Kristol for like Theo Vaughn and Don Jr. Like that's sort of his social world now. But I mean, I see what you're saying about like it is you do want people to be able to disagree and still be friendly with each other and cordial. I mean, at the same time, there can be like a clubbiness to it that I think is bad. I mean, where you're having these disagreements which are real. And you want to be able to get together afterwards and sort of break bread, but at the same time, like you don't want the disagreements to be pretend, And I think there is something to the critique of that, I'm not saying Tucker's right about like the elites per se, but like the way in which so many people missed Trump's rise, missed the creation of the conditions that allowed for someone like Trump to come along. I think there was a real blind spot there, and it was created in part by that kind of clubbishness. I mean, NAFTA wasn't hurting anybody in Washington. Like everybody was fine, and therefore they completely just ignored these problems that were festering. That then by the time they realized they were there, it was too late. Donald Trump was president. So I do think there is something to the critique of that kind of, what is it, the Georgetown cocktail party, or whatever, which I don't think exists anymore, but that sort of critique, I think there is something to it. But obviously the direction Tucker and others have taken it in is not the answer.
Well, I think, as they say on television, we are out of time. Thank you all so much for being here. Jason, thank you for writing this fantastic book, guiding us through this moment in American culture.